The British economist Lionel Robbins asked in his 1934 book, The Great Depression, why there should be a sudden, what he called, cluster of error among entrepreneurs. Given that the market, via the profit and loss system, weeds out the least competent entrepreneurs, why should the relatively more skilled ones that the market has rewarded with profits and control over additional resources suddenly commit grave errors, and all in the same direction? Could something outside the market economy, rather than anything that inheres in it, account for this phenomenon? Well, of course, as many of you know, Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek both pointed to artificial credit expansion, normally at the hands of a government-established central bank, as the non-market culprit. And of course, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974 for his work on what is known as Austrian business cycle theory. Now, we may be inclined, by the way, not to be very impressed by someone winning the Nobel Prize, given what happened in 2008. That was when Paul Krugman won the prize. For those of you who don't know who Paul Krugman is, you are enjoying a more tranquil life than I am, I'll say that. What's significant, though, is that Krugman wins the prize for saying pretty much what the Nobel Committee wants to hear. Hayek says, by and large, the opposite of what they want to hear, and he wins it, so I think that is significant. So when the central bank expands the money supply, for instance, when it buys government securities, it creates the money to do so out of thin air. This money either goes directly to commercial banks, or if the securities are purchased from an investment bank, very quickly makes its way to the commercial banks when the investment banks deposit the Fed's checks. In the same way that the price of any good tends to decline with an increase in supply, the influx of new money in this way leads to lower interest rates, since the banks have experienced an increase in loanable funds. The lower interest rates stimulate investment in long-term projects or those sectors of the economy that are more interest rate sensitive. Additional investment in, just for example, research and development, which can take many years to bear fruit, will suddenly seem potentially profitable, whereas it would not have been profitable without the lower financing costs brought about by the lower interest rates. So we describe research and development as belonging to a so-called higher order stage of production than a retail establishment selling hats, for example, since the hats are immediately available for consumers, while the commercial results of research and development will not be available for a relatively long time, if ever. The closer a stage of production is to the finished consumer good to which it contributes, the lower a stage we describe it as occupying. And of course, we've just seen the Hayekian triangle. On the free market, interest rates coordinate production across time. They ensure that the production structure is configured in a way that conforms to consumer preferences. If consumers want more of existing goods right now, the lower order stages of production expand. If, on the other hand, they are willing to postpone consumption in the present, interest rates encourage entrepreneurs to use this opportunity to devote factors of production to projects not geared towards satisfying immediate consumer wants, but which, once they come to fruition, will yield a greater supply of consumer goods in the future. Now, had the lower interest rates in our example been the result of voluntary saving by the public instead of central bank intervention, the relative decrease in consumption spending that is a correlative of such saving would have released resources for use in the higher order stages of production. So in other words, in the case of genuine saving, demand for consumer goods undergoes a relative decline. People are saving more and spending less than they used to. Consumer goods industries, in turn, undergo a relative contraction in response to the decrease in demand for consumer goods. factors of production that these industries once used, trucking services, for instance, are now released for use in more remote stages of the structure of production. Likewise for labor and other non-specific inputs. But when the market's freely established structure of interest rates is tampered with, this coordinating function is disrupted. Increased investment in higher order stages of production is undertaken at a time when demand for consumer goods has not slackened. The time structure of production is distorted, such that it no longer corresponds to the time pattern of consumer demand. Consumers are demanding goods in the present at a time when investment in future production is being disproportionately undertaken. Thus, when lower interest rates are the result of central bank policy rather than genuine saving, no let-up in consumer demand has taken place. If anything, the lower rates make people even more likely to spend than before. In this case, resources have not been released for use in the higher order stages. The economy instead finds itself in a tug of war over an unchanged supply of resources between the higher and lower order stages of production. With resources unexpectedly scarce, the resulting rise in costs threatens the profitability of the higher order projects. The central bank can artificially expand credit still further in order to bolster the higher order stages' position in this tug of war, but it merely postpones the inevitable. If the public's freely expressed pattern of saving and consumption will not support the diversion of resources to the higher order stages, but in fact pulls those resources back to those firms dealing directly in finished consumer goods, then the central bank is in a war against reality. It will eventually have to decide whether, in order to validate all the higher order expansion, it is prepared to expand credit at a galloping rate and risk destroying the currency altogether, or whether instead it must slow or abandon its expansion and let the economy adjust itself to real conditions. Now, it's important to notice that the problem is not a deficiency of consumption spending, as the popular view would have it. If anything, the trouble comes from too much consumption spending, and as a result, too little channeling of funds to other kinds of spending, namely, the expansion of higher order stages of production that cannot be profitably completed because the necessary resources are being pulled away precisely by the relatively and unexpectedly stronger demand for consumer goods. Stimulating consumption spending can only make things worse by intensifying the strain on the already collapsing profitability of investment in higher order stages. Note also that the precipitating factor of the business cycle is not some phenomenon inherent in the free market. It is intervention into the market that brings about the cycle of unsustainable boom and inevitable bust. Roger Garrison, a well-known U.S. business cycle theorist, says, saving gets us genuine growth, credit expansion gets us boom and bust. This phenomenon has preceded all of the major booms and busts in American history, including the 2007 bust and the contraction in 1920 to 21. The years preceding 1920 were characterized by a massive increase in the supply of money via the banking system, with reserve requirements having been halved by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and then with considerable credit expansion by the banks themselves. Total bank deposits more than doubled between January 1914, when the Fed opened its doors, and January 1920. Such artificial credit creation sets the boom-bust cycle in motion. The Fed also kept its discount rate, the rate at which it lends directly to banks, low throughout the First World War and for a brief period thereafter. The Fed began to tighten its stance in late 1919. Once credit began to tighten, market actors suddenly began to realize that the structure of production had to be rearranged, and that lines of production dependent on easy credit had been erroneously begun and needed to be liquidated. We are now in a position to evaluate such perennially fashionable proposals as fiscal stimulus, nearly always meant in the form of increases in government spending, and its various cousins. Think about the condition of the economy following an artificial boom. It is saddled with imbalances. Too many resources have been employed in higher order or interest rate sensitive stages of production, and too few in lower order stages. These imbalances must be corrected by entrepreneurs who, enticed by higher rates of profit in the lower order stages, bid resources away from stages that have expanded too much and allocate them toward lower order stages where they are more in demand. The absolute freedom of prices and wages to fluctuate is essential to the accomplishment of this task, since wages and prices are themselves indispensable ingredients of entrepreneurial appraisal. In light of this description of the post-boom economy, we can see how unhelpful, even irrelevant, are efforts at fiscal stimulus. The government's mere act of spending money on arbitrarily chosen projects does nothing to rectify the imbalances that led to the crisis. It is not a decline in spending per se that has caused the problem. It is a mismatch between the kind of production the capital structure has been misled into undertaking on the one hand, and the pattern of consumer demand, which cannot sustain the structure of production as it is, on the other. It is not unfair to refer to the recipients of fiscal stimulus as arbitrary projects. Since government lacks a profit and loss mechanism and can acquire additional resources through outright expropriation of the public, it has no way of knowing whether it is actually satisfying consumer demand, if it is concerned about this at all, or whether its use of resources is grotesquely wasteful. Popular rhetoric notwithstanding, government cannot be run like a business. Monetary stimulus is no help either. And incidentally, we could also talk about the so-called idle resources problem, but that does not validate fiscal stimulus either. Monetary stimulus only intensifies the problem. In Human Action, Mises compared an economy under the influence of artificial credit expansion to a master builder commissioned to construct a house that, unbeknownst to him, he lacks sufficient bricks to complete. The sooner he discovers his error, the better. The longer he persists in this unsustainable project, the more resources and labor time he will irretrievably squander. Monetary stimulus merely encourages entrepreneurs to continue along their unsustainable production trajectories. My own personal contribution to Austrian business cycle theory is to introduce into Mises' allegory of the master builder the idea of getting the master builder drunk because we feel sorry for him, that inevitably he's going to discover that the house he's building cannot be completed, so we hate to see this be realized by him, so instead we just intoxicate him so that he just continues on building without thinking about tomorrow. But that doesn't make the house buildable now. The house still can't be built, but now he'll persist in building it all the longer. And in fact, in the United States, we just experienced exactly this. In 2001, Alan Greenspan did the equivalent of getting the master builder drunk. Instead of allowing the economy to reconfigure itself, instead of allowing the bus to take its course, he liquored up the master builder. So that all this time we have been continuing along unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. So that the bust is much worse than it would have been if we had stopped in 2001.